Dave, for you. Good morning. How are you, Gabi? Good to see you. I'm going to put one extra. I need more handouts next week. Thank you, Mike. Well, I'm glad to be with y'all this morning. Welcome. We are starting a new 3-week series today on the wilderness. And let's start with a video, a humorous video, and then we'll pray and we'll get more serious. How many of you have seen the Disney Pixar movie Up? Up? All right. Well, this has been featured in a meme of late going around, and so I share it just for humor. It's just a 2-minute clip from the movie. Let's enjoy this for a minute.
Order now. You get the camera, you get the printer, 4x optical zoom, Schneider lens, photo printer, SD card.
Good afternoon. My name is Russell, and I am a wilderness explorer in Tribe 54, Sweat Lodge 12. Are you in need of any assistance today, sir?
No.
I could help you cross the street.
No.
I could help you cross your yard.
No.
I could help you cross your porch.
No.
Well, I gotta help you cross something.
No, I'm doing fine.
Good afternoon. My name is Russell, and I am a wilderness explorer in Tribe 54.
Slow down.
Sweat Lodge 12.
Kid!
Are you in need of
Thank
any
you,
assistance
but I don't need
today?
any help.
Ow.
Proceed.
Good afternoon.
Let's skip to the end.
See these? These are my Wilderness Explorer badges. You may notice one is missing. It's my Assisting the Elderly badge. If I get it, I will become a senior Wilderness Explorer. The wilderness must be explored! Go, go! Roar! It's gonna be great. There's a big ceremony, and all the dads come, and they pin on our badges.
So, you want to assist an old person?
Yep, then I will be a senior Wilderness Explorer.
You ever heard of a snipe?
Snipe?
Bird. Beady eyes. Every night it sneaks in my yard and gobbles my poor azaleas. I'm elderly and infirm. I can't catch it. If only someone could help me.
Me! I'll do it!
Oh, I don't know. It's awfully crafty. You'd have to clap your hands 3 times to lure it in.
I'll find him, Mr. Fredrickson.
I think its burrow's 2 blocks down. If you
2
go
blocks
past
down, got it. Snipe. Here, snipey.
The wilderness must be explored, or something like that. Let's pray. I'm going to show on the screen the handout for those watching at home. Also, I made 30 handouts thinking that would be plenty, and there are not enough handouts, which is great. I'm so glad that we are here. So if you can't see it on your table, then perhaps you can see it on the screen. But let's start with this opening prayer. I'll confess this is a slightly strange opening prayer, but I really like it. So let's pray. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite that easily, but we'll get through it. Let's pray this prayer together. Lord of the fast, we come before you as sinners, but fully aware of your divine mercy. Still, we need this fast, for only in stepping away from the things of this world are we able to fathom the immeasurable gift that is our redemption. Turn our noses from the sense around us, that we may again know the sweet fragrance of Christ. Numb our tongues from all that allures them, so that we may taste anew the bread of salvation. Dull our touch to all sensations, so that we may feel only the pulse of our hearts, longing to reconcile with our brothers and sisters and you, our Maker. Stop our ears from all that lure them, so that we may hear your song of mercy calling us back to the embrace of our Father. Blind our eyes from all that distracts them, so that we may gaze fully on the light of Christ. And once we have met you there in the wilderness, then return us to the world. Send us back among your people, that we may fill their senses with all we have found in you, all that is good, all that is loving, all that is merciful. Amen. What do you think about wilderness? What's your experience of wilderness? We've got a microphone. Dave will bring it around to you. We've got a microphone. What's your experience of wilderness? Have you ever been in the wilderness? Do you go regularly? Are you scared of the wilderness? Do you live in the wilderness? What's your experience of wilderness? If you'll raise your hand, Dave will bring the mic so that we can hear you and so that those at home can hear you. Yeah. Oops, that's not helpful.
In a United States wilderness area, you can camp and hunt, but you cannot use a motor vehicle.
Yeah, thank you. And in a wilderness area, they don't allow power tools. So as a result, if trees fall down, then the only way to clear the path is with a handsaw, which means it's a little rugged. They also don't mark the paths with any signs. It's supposed to be wilderness in that way. And also, they try to steer airplanes away from them so that you can avoid even hearing the airplane that flies overhead. I don't know if you know that about United States Protected Wilderness Area, but it's pretty significant. And isn't it wonderful, Adam? Isn't it great? Yeah, absolutely. What else is your experience? Yeah.
Immediately backpacking in the wilderness of Wyoming and fly fishing with my dad.
Yeah, and a family story there too. Yeah. What else? Yeah, all the way across the room. Oh, we'll start here with James and then across the room with Jim.
Sure. So I'm from scouting. The wilderness is usually somewhere that you go off into, and you don't really have any contact with anybody else. Your devices, you don't have a cell phone, you don't have anything like that. And you go and you camp and you have your fire and you have with your company that's there. But the whole rest of the world is disconnected. Like there's nothing else. You're sacrificing all the modern conveniences. I mean, you want to go use a toilet? Well, there's a ditch over there,
Yeah.
So that's the wilderness thing, so to me.
Yeah, thank you. And Jim, across the room.
Yeah, I just think wilderness is relaxing and rejuvenating. When you drive down into Boxley Valley and you lose your cell phone coverage, you just feel all that tension just melt away, and it's just relaxing.
Yeah, thank you. Jeannie Wayne, who's a member of our vestry, she shared that she goes on some intentional retreats, silent retreats, and she'll go on a 10-day silent retreat and not speak a word or text a word to anybody for 10 solid days. And she says that for the first 4 or 5 days, it's just everything's in her mind, but it takes 4 days of being unplugged in a different kind of wilderness for something else to happen, for silence to take over. Yeah, wilderness.
When I returned to Arkansas several decades ago, I lived 2 miles from the nearest electric pole, and it was very peaceful, and the rhythm of life was very relaxing, and I set about making things not wilderness again by adding lamps and propane and et cetera.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's lovely.
Yeah. So let me transition to the next bit. What does our culture say about wilderness? Look, the culture we live in, 21st century America, Arkansas, Fayetteville, the culture that we inhabit. How does our culture engage wilderness? What do we think about wilderness culturally? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Janet. I was just going to say we generally feel like it needs to be tamed and controlled.
Yeah.
Even though they're big into Greenbelt and Greenway around here, but even that is very regimented and controlled.
Yeah, the wilderness must be explored.
Which I'm not objecting to, by the way.
Yeah. Our family has a scout, and our scout went on an expedition this weekend, and there's a nature trail, and the scout troop actually missed the nature trail altogether because it was paved. And they kept looking for it, but they were on it. They didn't even realize they were on it because it's a paved nature trail, which says so much about it. Yeah, who's got the microphone? Yeah, Haley.
So I have a little bit of the opposite thing to say, is that we want it to stay completely untouched by humans, and if you're harvesting any natural resources, then it's no longer a real wilderness.
Yeah. So if we start harvesting resources, it's not a wilderness? Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you have to leave it exactly the way it was, but we don't even have those old growth forests anymore, really. So
yeah,
it's difficult to have.
Thank you. Yeah. Other cultural perspectives on wilderness? Yeah.
So I think we forget that it's a finite thing, and it's not just taming it, but it's simply a resource for a lot of people and a dollar sign.
Yeah. Yeah, it's become that. So I want to, like, the wilderness must be explored is a great, like, we feel that pull. But what's interesting is every person who shared an experience of wilderness, I heard you say something inviting. I heard you say, like, it's where we want to go. It's where we want to be. We feel drawn there. We feel pulled there. And yet, culturally, we recognize that it's disappearing. It's threatening. You know, isn't it, like, we feel that. I think it's a fascinating human pull to experience wilderness, but also to recognize that if we over-experience it, it disappears, right? Because once you put up a house, it's not wilderness anymore, right? All right, so let me ask about biblical, the third question on your list. Like, can you think of, today we're talking about Hagar, so there's one answer, but can you think of any, when you think of wilderness in the Bible, are there any stories of wilderness that you think of? Or I saw your hand up earlier, so share, yeah.
So for the biblical thing, we've been talking about the beauty of nature, but in the biblical wilderness, it's kind of a dangerous place where your security is not guaranteed and your life might be at risk.
Yeah, wild play, right? Yeah, risky place. Yeah, other biblical examples or characteristics.
I was just going to add and say that in the Bible and even in like pretty recent American history, I think now the wilderness pulls us and is inviting and cool and you know, Chaco's commercials. But in Jesus' time or even, there was nowhere to go, right? Nowadays, we can go into the wilderness, and if we get lost, we can probably find like a town or some lights on or something. But, you know, before that, the wilderness was like, stay out of there. Like,
yeah.
You know.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I was just going to say 2 examples of biblical wilderness would be the first book of the Bible in Genesis when Adam and Eve had to leave the garden.
Yep.
And then the other one, of course, is when Jesus went into the wilderness after his baptism.
Yeah, thank you. Yep, there are 2 examples. What other biblical references do you think of? Yeah, right next to you.
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist, yeah. Any others? Just right, I mean, any others? Israel, right? The nation of Israel, when they leave Egypt, they spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. There's that one. That becomes like the principal reference in most of the prophetic texts. Remember, like the long journey of Israel in the wilderness as they made their way from Egypt to the land of promise, to the land of Canaan, and lots of episodes. And those episodes become a touchstone for prophets who say either things like, remember how God saved you from the wilderness, or you're rebelling just like your ancestors did in the wilderness, or you're going to be lost forever if you don't get your act together in the wilderness. So it becomes kind of a story. That's not the only example. Think also about the Psalms. The Psalms do some of the same. Sometimes the Psalms will remind us that God is the one who was with us in the wilderness or saved us from the wilderness. But also the wilderness becomes in the Psalms the place where God shows up. God's voice splits the rocks, makes the trees arrive. Like all God's power seems to be exhibited in the wilderness where we haven't tamed it yet. So there's a bit of that. Also, remember the scapegoat? Do you remember the Leviticus story that during the Day of Atonement, the high priest lays his hands on the head of what's known as the scapegoat and then sends it off in the wilderness? Sometimes we think the scapegoat gets killed. It actually doesn't get killed. It gets sit loose in the wilderness, that place in the wilderness. Also, wilderness is a boundary, right? Partly, literally, a boundary for the land of promise. When the land is partitioned off, it says from this river, and then the wilderness area. But it's also named as a boundary for a lot of the cities of Judah. But there are lots of stories of wilderness. In this adult forum, we've done a series on desert mothers and fathers, desert Christians. And whenever you hear the word desert, hear wilderness. So when we think of these great St. Anthony of Egypt, of Agrius, these wonderful, revered, mystic saints, usually from the maybe 3rd, but probably 4th, 5th century and beyond, and we call them desert saints. desert and wilderness are the same word in the Bible, and it's the same concept. So actually, they're kind of wilderness saints, which maybe they teach us a different way of exploring wilderness or encountering wilderness. But what I want to do in this series, it's a 3-week series that not accidentally leads us to the edge of Lent, right? Lent is our own wilderness journey, our own spiritual wilderness journey. And so in these 3 weeks, I want to look at 3 different examples of wilderness. I want to see primarily, where does God meet God's people in the wilderness? How does God show up? And the hypothesis that I'll offer you is that God's people experience God in the wilderness in ways that they can't experience God in the city or the temple or the palace. Like, God is able to show up to us in ways outside the bounds of civilization, in ways that there's no way for us to experience that here. In Fayetteville, at St. Paul's, there's just no way for us to do it. We've got to go to wilderness. And often that's a physical journey. Sometimes it's a spiritual journey, or maybe an economic journey in some other ways. But I want to explore these 3 examples. I want to start with Hagar this week, and the covenant God makes with Hagar in the wilderness. Next week, I want to look at the story of Elijah. You might remember when Elijah is fleeing from danger. He flees through the wilderness, and God shows up. You might remember the still small voice. We'll read that passage. And then I want to go to Jesus' time in the wilderness. The week before, we hear that as the gospel lesson on the first Sunday in Lent. So we'll explore some of that together. Any questions about where we've been or about where we're headed before we read the text and then dig in? Any reflections or questions that you've got so far? Well, let's read the story of Hagar. This is only part of Hagar's story. This is from Genesis 16. And we're going to read the first half of Genesis 16, and we're going to reflect on it, and then we'll read the second half and finish with some reflections. Who would read for us, please, that first bit of Genesis 16, which is there on the screen? Who would read that for us, please? Dave will bring you the microphone. Thank you, Rich.
I hope there's no hard words. Sarai, is that the right way?
Sure.
So if I just say Sarah, because that's my daughter's name.
That'll work too. We'll know who you mean.
Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So, after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave, and gave to her husband Abram as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Your slave is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her.
Thank you. What do you notice? What do you notice? What part of that story is troubling, interesting, humorous, devastating? What part of that, how do you encounter that story today? What do you notice? What words have energy or power for you? Yeah.
I think the reflection on Sarah for not bearing Abraham children is significant to push her to such a great length as to give her slave to him to share an intimate bond with her husband.
Yes.
I mean, that's the most troubling, well, maybe not the most troubling, but initially the most troubling thing to
Yeah,
do.
thank you. Yeah, thank you. What else do you notice? Yeah.
Sarai puts it on God that she can't have children.
Yes.
She says, "You see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children."
Yes, God has an interesting role in this chapter. First, where you point out in verse 2 that Sarai, it's God's fault, right? But then again at the end, when in verse 5, at the end of this part, where she invokes the Lord's name and sort of says, all right, the Lord judge between you and me, speaking to her husband, right? Yeah, so interesting way to invoke the divine name. Yeah, yeah. What else? What else do you notice? Yeah.
Abram is so callous about Hagar. I'll just do what you want to. Here, she's yours.
Yeah.
That's troubling.
Yeah, thank you. Haley, and then I'll offer a reflection. Yeah.
I'd never noticed this before, but like she gives her as a wife.
Yes.
And then he, it's his wife, but he says, no, it's your problem. This is your slave.
Yeah.
So that's extremely weird. I thought that I didn't realize.
Yeah. Yeah, Dr. Gaffney, Will Gaffney points that out in some of her Womanist Midrash that we looked at, that whatever you make of this arrangement, the Bible clearly names Hagar as wife, but she won't be treated as wife anymore, right? Yeah, yeah. So even, like, you don't have to have done any formal training when you read the story to begin to interpret it, right? You don't need to have gone to seminary or know Hebrew or know anything else about the Bible. Just start with, when you hear this story, how do you feel about Sarai? How do you feel about Abram? How do you feel about Hagar? And I presume that none of us has sympathy for, or at least overwhelming sympathy for Sarai. We do recognize that the system she's a part of, the expectations, unrealistic and unfair though they may be, that are placed upon her, have forced her to this just impossible situation. And yet the way she responds, we might understand it, but the text doesn't ask us to weep for Sarai, and it doesn't ask us to weep for Abram. Abram does not look good in this story. There's nothing good about Abram in the story. It feels to me like all of our sympathy falls on Hagar, right? Hagar doesn't even have control of her own body, right? Doesn't have control over her own child, is made a wife, and then it's taken away from her. It's hard for me to read this story and not feel drawn into the life of Hagar, which is strange if you know the rest of the Abram story. Like, Hagar disappears, and her child is a threat. Like, the Jewish narrative, the Hebrew story, has got to tell the story of covenant, but it can't be through Hagar and Ishmael. It's got to be through Sarah and Isaac. And yet, this text, whether it's a story that was preserved and then woven into the story, or whether the dominant voice wants to give it to us, I think it is significant that right in the middle of the Bible, we take time to not only tell the story of Hagar, but to tell it in a way that draws us into it and doesn't allow us to brush her aside the way that Abram eventually will and that Sarah wants to. Yeah, Trip.
Well, yeah, it's like when you're watching a movie and they introduce a character, you think, okay, that character just didn't pop up here for no reason. And it almost makes you think that there's some part of this story that's missing.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Walter Brueggemann, in his commentary on this text, he notes that it has to be unfinished. Like, it can't be wrapped up. The whole story is unfinished. He also likens this to labor pains. Like, we don't know yet that Sarah's going to have a child, and it's going to be Isaac, and that's going to be good. But this story becomes, in a way, Abram and Sarai's labor pains, as they're trying to figure out how is this going to come to pass? How is this birth going to happen? Anyway, yeah, and it's unfinished, and it's messy, and we don't see it. Yeah, Mandy.
I've often thought of this story as really having. I think that Sarah, as a wife, looks at a situation in her family and thinks, "What can I do to fix this? I need to fix this." And sometimes we take things on ourselves to fix it, and it ends up not being the right way, but God takes over and fixes it in the end.
Yeah.
So I look at Sarah with a great deal of, as a wife, looking at a family, saying, "What can I do to fix this?"
Absolutely, and I think in some ways, I've done you a disservice by only reading chapter 16. We don't have time to read the whole thing, but chapter 16. In another way, the text does I think the text wants us to notice more than anything her struggle with faith, and it doesn't, well, it ends up fine. Maybe we would say that God's graciousness is bigger than Sarah's doubts. But at the end of chapter 15, if you turned back a page, you can't, but if you turn back a page, you would see that right at the end of 15, God reiterates his covenant with Abram and Sarah and says, your very own heir, not Eliezer of Damascus, your very own heir will happen. And in the very next words, Sarah's like, all right, I got to do something about this. God apparently hasn't done what God needs to do. God has closed my womb, so I'm 80-something years old. I've got to go around the back door. So let me figure out this Hagar stuff. So in a way, I think part of what her story draws us into is how often do we underestimate God's ability to show up? Yeah, and she ends up being a character who helps us see that. But what's interesting is then to contrast her faithfulness with Hagar's faithfulness. Yeah. Yeah, so let me draw just a couple of things, then we get to the wilderness part of the story. So notice the significance of Sarai's plan, right? She knows that her husband, at least as the story is told to us, is the one through whom God's promise will be brought, the father of many nations, descendants as numerous as the stars in the heavens. And so her plan is her own kind of response to her inability, and Abram's too, let's not forget Abram, inability to understand how this promise is going to be fulfilled. And so the fact that she invokes the Lord's name at the beginning lets us know that she's trying to be faithful, but sometimes our best intentions are miss the point. Notice at the end of the story, though, when in verse 6, Abram says, your slave is in your power, do to her as you please. Like, notice that Hagar went from being slave to being wife to being slave. Like, and Abram had the power to do that. Like, Abram accepted her as wife, and then as soon as Sarai said, I don't know about that, he said, fine, she's yours. I let go of my authority over her, my ability to claim her as equal, as spouse. She's back in your care. I will not do with her as you wish. How quickly her fortunes change. So notice, I'm going to draw a line under it. Let's turn the page and let's read the next bit. Oh, well, I'm not going to turn the page yet. Hold on, sorry, turn back. In verse 4, at the end of verse 4, when we read that Hagar looked with contempt on her mistress, that's probably too strong of a translation. We hear that, we think, oh, look at her, she got uppity, right? We would like, right? But actually, the language implies a physical downcastedness, but it doesn't mean that that Hagar scorned her. It really just means that Hagar, her identity as wife and spouse was fulfilled, and so as a result, the relationship between Sarai and Hagar had been reset as equals. They essentially were equals. And so Sarai is not responding to torment at this point. Sarah is responding to her former slave now becoming her equal. If you've ever been a part of any system in which the oppressed is liberated, it can be hard for the oppressor to recognize that the oppressed is no longer under their control, right? And systems resist that kind of change and resist it powerfully. And so don't look with contempt upon Hagar, because she's really not holding Sarai in contempt. It's really just a refocusing of that relationship. Would be a better way to translate. Other translations do it differently. All right, now turn the page. Who would read for us, please, the rest of Genesis 16? There are some words in this that I don't know how to pronounce, but if you pronounce them boldly, we will all be very impressed with your pronunciation. Who would read this part of Genesis 16 for us, pretty please? Thank you. Perfect. Thank you.
The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am running away from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, now you have conceived and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall live at odds with all his kin. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, You are Elroy, for she said, Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Beer Elai Roy. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son, who Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael.
Thank you. So, what's interesting about this passage, this part of the passage? What's interesting to you? Yeah, Haley, and then Richard.
The angel confirms that she's a slave. It doesn't confirm that she's a wife.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. The mouthpiece of God goes right back to the way things were always. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, one thing I learned is that Hagar is Egyptian for the stranger, which helps to other her also. She doesn't have power and control, and she's also a stranger. She still, however, can encounter the Lord God, but she gives the God a different name than we would know him by, which I think is pretty interesting. It's based on her vision of God by the spring. I think it means God of visions, actually. So I just think that's all really interesting. Yeah. And then, of course, on the humor side, Hagar is also the name of a rock star in the 80s. And there are just too many good jokes about a wild-ass man joining a hair band in Los Angeles and all that. So, but it's just about different levels of power and control. You kind of raise and fall, and as things happen, you get control, and it's taken from you, and you get it back, and sometimes it's paradoxical. You admit you're a slave and you submit, but that gives you a certain amount of control in the situation, which is all very interesting and it's complex. So.
Thank you. What else? What else did you notice? Adam, and then I'll make a comment.
It makes me think of the angel appearing to Mary and saying, hey, you're going to have a son, and he's going to be like this and do these kinds of things, which is happening here. But
yeah, and I can't remember which commentator. It was either Von Rad or Brueggemann who noted, isn't it interesting that thousands of years later, the form is still there? Because if you think about the Annunciation to Mary by the angel, you shall conceive and you shall bear a son and you shall name him, right? There's this sense that this is the way God did it 5,000 years ago, and now, or 4,000 years ago, to 2,000 years ago, and then when Mary did it, when the angel did it to Mary, another 2,000 years since now. Yep, yeah. Isn't that remarkable? I want to pick up on what Richard said. Hagar, and you've maybe heard me say this before, Hagar is the only person in the Bible to give God a name. She is the only person in the Bible to give God a name. God gives God's name, but the only one who names God, think about that. Think about what does it mean to name something, right? You name your pet, you name your child, you name your car, you name your boat, right? Because you have control over that, you have mastery over that, you're in charge of that. Nobody names God except for Hagar. Isn't that interesting? Just note something really remarkable is happening when Hagar names God. And she names the God who sees me, El Roy, the God who sees me. And there's an ideological tenet. Apparently there's a geographical name that needs to be associated with the story. And El Roy, as you can see, the well is named that way. But it didn't have to be this way. They didn't have to give Hagar the ability to name God. The narrator could have just said, and this happened here, but isn't it remarkable that Hagar gets to name God? Also, she's the only woman in the Bible with whom God makes a covenant. She's the only woman whom God makes a promise to, right? You shall conceive and bear a son. He shall be a wild ass of his man. But notice before that in verse 10, I will so greatly multiply your offspring. Not Abram's offspring, not Ishmael's offspring, your offspring. Her lineage is named through her, at least in this version of the story. The Quran has a different way of remembering what happened to Hagar and to Ishmael. But it's her offspring. So in a way, the same promise that had been given to Abram, who becomes Abraham, is also given to Hagar. So in a sense, she is a patriarch. She's a matriarch. She's the mother of a nation, of a people, as numerous as the stars of heaven, we might say, or the sand on the seashore. What do you make of that? Why? Let me just ask that question. Why do you think the remembrance of this story gives Hagar that unique status as the only one who names God and the only woman through whom a covenant is offered? What does that tell us about Hagar's role in the mind of the narrator and the community as the story gets transmitted to us? Yeah.
I keep thinking about the fact that she started in the story as a slave, as somebody who was nothing. Yep. And now she's elevated to the importance of being the only person in the Bible to do those things that you just mentioned. I mean, that's like you go from the very bottom to a position of great importance, or at least stature in the story.
Yeah, thank you. What else? Yeah, right next to you.
Well, along with what Richard said, I love the fact that Hagar got caught up in this thing between the other two, and then she got upset and she left. But she got all this inspiration when she was in the wilderness. So she's out of all the materialistic feuding and all of that stuff. In the wilderness, she is open to this inspiration and the Word of God.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That anticipates where I'm going to go in a minute. Yep. Jane, and then up here to Mandy.
The thing that stands out to me about Hagar is that like all this, like the status part of it all, that's man-made. Like we made that story up, and God said, no, actually, I'm going to decide who does what. And you can tell yourself those stories, but I'm going to make that all equal and right.
Yeah. Yeah. Mandy, raise your hand. Yep.
I don't know. This would be my question. Is it God's view of the balancing feminine to the masculine?
Yeah. Say more.
Like what happened? Well, just like what you had said, this is God's promise to Abraham, but then God promises it on the feminine side as well. And that shows God's view and love of equality between the feminine and the masculine.
Yeah, thank you. I want to spring from that, but let's hear from Pam first.
Well, just back to that. Women's lib is the thing I've been thinking ever since we read this passage, that here's maybe the first narrative about women's lib.
Yeah, yeah. So let's linger with gender, but I want to start with wilderness, and I'm going to come back to gender. Like, why does this take place in the wilderness? What's the role of wilderness in this story? And I'm going to ask you to use your spiritual imagination, because there's only one word. It was in the wilderness that this happened to take place. The author doesn't make a big deal about it, but I want you to sort of lean into that possibility and just allow yourself to wonder, like, why does this take place in the wilderness? What is it about wilderness that makes this story make sense or makes this story possible? Yeah.
I think in the wilderness, you're stripped of all societal suppositions, traditions, et cetera, and so you don't have those things to muddle the pond, if you will.
Yeah, thank you. What else? The opening prayer that we prayed, there's something about numb me to this, or close my ears to that, or let my eyes not be distracted by this. Wilderness, there's the beauty of the wilderness, of course, but the wilderness is by definition the place where the city is not, where civilization is not. And so as a result, I often think of those as comforts, right? I like sleeping in a bed. I like heat. I like not having to cook my food on a campfire, but every once in a while it's kind of nice to do that, but not so much because the food's any better, but doesn't it taste better when you're in the wilderness, right? Doesn't it, like there's something pure about it, and I sense that when those distractions, which are largely our connection to power, control, authority, when that gets stripped away, as you invite us to see, then we're able to receive something different. Yeah.
So there's not really any direct reference to wilderness in this particular story, but you can kind of see like the cultural reference to, usually you'll see like the hero or the protagonist in a story will go off into the wilderness, and when they come back, they have some sort of change have been inflicted on them.
Yeah.
So Hagar has was the wife, and then she got punished by Sarah for doing so. And so now she goes off and she's devastated about this, and she wants to separate. And then she goes off into her own personal wilderness, and that's where God reaches out to her, and she comes back changed.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at verse 7, there is wilderness, right? Look at verse 7. But it's not much made of it. But your point is a good one, which is it's her leaving the control, the authority, the place. So God doesn't show up in her tent when she's weeping because she's lost her status as spouse and she's now a slave again. God shows up when she's left that behind, right? And it's only as she leaves that behind. I think that also, to tie that into gender, I think there's something about, and I'm speaking of the ancient sort of gender dynamics there, there's something about God showing up among the powerless and the stranger. I mean, as Richard points out, her name is a word that can be translated stranger. To think about the way in which the community preserves this story to remind us that God doesn't only care about the people in the covenant. God also cares about the people outside of the Abrahamic covenant. That God isn't only interested in Abraham and Sarai and his children. Like, we don't need Hagar and Ishmael to tell the story of God's covenant relationship with God's people. But we can't know the God who loves all peoples, who has a relationship with all peoples, and particularly the stranger, the ostracized, the outcast. We can't know that about God without story of Hagar, without the story of Ishmael. So there's an important reminder that this story takes place in the wilderness, but it's not just a physical wilderness. It's about where God searches for people, where God meets people. Sometimes they claim a covenant identity with God, and sometimes they don't. Yeah.
I'm confused about something. I wondered if you could explain why it happened. It begins, the angel of the Lord found her.
Mm-hmm.
Later, she perceives it to be a Lord who spoke to her and names a God.
Yeah.
So why did they tell the story this way?
Yeah, the Bible often flips back and forth. And so think of, when we hear angel, I think of winged creature. But actually, it's not until the medieval period that we really understand that that's what angels were. The word angel means messenger. So just remember also the story when Jacob wrestles with the angel by the riverbank before he goes and meets his estranged brother. And the beginning of the story says he wrestled with the angel of God, but in the middle of the story, it's like he's wrestling with God. And then at the end of the story, it's an angel again. Essentially, we can't tell, and neither could Hagar tell whether she was talking to the angel or to God. And essentially, the distinction disappears. Some scholars think that there's a sort of a primitive theology that God is kind of a shape-shifting character, that God shows up as if a being, an embodied being, that's borrowing from some neighboring religious traditions that Israel might have been influenced by. I don't know a lot about that, but suffice it for me to say that whether Hagar is talking to an angel or to God, God's self, there's really no difference. We would understand it to be the same thing. Kind of like an agent, right? If an agent legally acts on behalf of the person, so if the agent signs the contract, it doesn't matter whether it was the agent or the principal. The contract is signed and it's legally binding. In the same way, this angel is like God's agent, so it might as well be God. There's really no difference. Yeah. Yep. And then we'll close.
A brief note on that. from my perspective, I always I go back to where Jesus was the Word made flesh, and how when the Word of God is presented, that it's as God. So he lives within his Word. That's how I look at it anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And I do think incarnation would have a different understanding of God showing up, like not just sort of an apparition, but actual sort of but yes, absolutely, yes. All right, so wilderness. Hold on to wilderness. Next week, we're going to look at a different story of wilderness. We're going to look at Elijah, the prophet who is running for his life, and we'll see where God shows up in the wilderness, but maybe in another surprising way. I hope each of these weeks is a chance to be surprised that God shows up, and to remember that God shows up in wilderness and among people in wilderness in ways that most of us can never apprehend, because we wake up and we flip on a light switch and we turn on the water. So pursuing an experience of wilderness, physical or otherwise, is an important way for us to encounter God afresh. Thank you all, and hope to see you next week.